So this is a demonstration that I'm doing with colored powder to show one way that I conceptualize light. And I've arranged these dark objects in a shadow box and tried to really limit the amount of light that's getting into the setup. And that's to show that objects in the world, in the absence of light, are not visible to us. They're not visually tangible. You could think of it that way. It's impossible to decipher form in the absence of light. And here I've used as an analogy to light particles or photons, this colored powder. And as it slowly deposits on these objects, it starts to reveal more about the lay of the land and the form of the object. Think here of snow falling on rock faces. So on a snowy day, where the snow emanates from the sky, those facets of the land that face most perpendicular to the sky receive the greatest deposits of snow. And then incrementally, as the planes turn away from the sky, they receive slightly less. By the time there are vertical planes, they're receiving only a glancing dusting of snow, and by the time they're undercuts, there's no snow received at all. So in our case, as representational painters, we're not thinking of snow, we're thinking of light. And light can come from many different sources. So we're not talking about the sky per se. We could be talking about the sun or an artificial light source. But it still helps to think about the planes of the object we're painting and their orientation in space relative to the light source. When we pan around, we see that the setup is essentially divided into areas of powder and no powder. It's essentially like a no-tan or two-tone design. And really only those areas just right where the two meet do you get a halftone. So I'm doing the experiment again for good measure, this time with orange powder, and also run through a filter to make the effect a little more dramatic. Here I've tried to be mindful of how I've arranged the figure relative to the cloth, so that here, as the powder develops specifically on the back and head of the deer, it's going to be juxtaposed up against this dark cavern of cloth in the background. So we have the lit deer up against a shadowed background. Correspondingly, because the legs are downward facing planes or vertically facing planes, they're going to receive no powder. And here I wanted to put areas of upward facing cloth that would catch the powder so that you would have the dark object up against a lit background. And I find that if you're very attuned when you create your own setups to not only the arrangement of objects, but the objects relative to the light, you can start to design these kinds of games, almost like a movie director directing the light. I find that kind of foundness, that juxtaposition of light and shadows, very impactful. And then if you interplay that with areas of lostness or passage, where the edges of objects are lost, it's a pleasing and dramatic effect. So of course, in nature, things are much more complicated. And light doesn't act like powder necessarily. Light is very complicated. It has a dual particle wave nature. And so it's not as simple as matter depositing on subjects. And also in nature, we rarely have single tone or single color objects within a controlled setup like a shadow box. But I always find it simple to boil down the workings of what's going on in the most simple way, create the most simple working model, and to elaborate from there on. So again, here we have the result, which basically breaks the scene down into areas of powder and no powder, with just little bits of glancing halftone where the two meet. So to drive the point home, I've run this through a two-tone filter. But in any case, this is a helpful way that I use to break down the complexity of nature into simple elements.